So today I'm going to be going over a section of AP Biology Unit 1, which is going to be types of bonds and the properties of water. So I'm going to talk about the types of bonds, hydrogen bonding, and how that relates to the many properties of water. So the types of bonds I'm going to be talking about today are covalent bonds, ionic bonds, and weak chemical bonds. As a side note, you do kind of have to remember that ionic bonds are considered a weak chemical bond, but for the purpose of this lesson, I'm going to be talking about them separately. So covalent bonds are formed when electrons are shared evenly among atoms. These bonds can be either polar or nonpolar. So as an example, I have an image of a water molecule. So the red atom here is going to be oxygen, and the two white atoms are going to be considered hydrogen. As you can see, the oxygen is painted as negative because the oxygen is partially negatively charged, and that means that the bond we formed between these two atoms are considered a polar bond, which means that the electrons are shared unevenly. And this is based on electronegativity. As some of you may know, oxygen is more electronegative than hydrogen, which means that it is going to attract electrons more, which makes oxygen more negative than the hydrogen that it forms a covalent bond with. In this image, we have an example of a non-polar bond. This is a bond formed between two identical atoms, which means two hydrogens. The bonds formed between two identical atoms are almost always going to be non-polar because not one is more electronegative than the other. They have the same electronegativity, which means that they're going to have the same bond. The strongest bonds in organisms are covalent bonds, which makes them very important in life. So I'm going to talk about the weak chemical bonds next. As I mentioned, ionic bonds are considered weak bonds. I'm also going to be talking about hydrogen bonds and van der Waals interactions. So hydrogen bonds are very important because they make up much of water's properties that I'm going to be talking about next. So this is usually formed between a partially positive and a partially negative atom. So as you can see here, the oxygen, as I mentioned before, is going to be considered a partially negative atom because of that polar covalent bond. And the white hydrogen over here is going to be a partially positive atom. And that means that these two, partially negative and partially positive, are going to be able to attract and form a hydrogen bond. Hydrogen bonds can be formed between any electronegative atom and hydrogen. It doesn't have to be hydrogen and oxygen. It's often also hydrogen and nitrogen. So van der Waals interactions are formed because electrons are constantly moving. So electrons in regions, electrons will be moving, and sometimes it will be positive, but if an electron moves away or if an electron comes in, it can be negative, which means that these regions can often have interactions as well. When it's positive and negative, they can come together. And if there's a lot of them, they can become quite strong, even though individually they are quite weak. So geckos are quite famous for being able to stick on windows and stick on walls, and that is because of the van der Waals interactions going on between that surface and their feet, which makes them able to stick onto surfaces quite easily. So these are the properties of water that I'm going to mention in this video. It's going to be cohesion, adhesion, surface tension, moderation of temperature, floating ice, and how water acts as a solvent of life. So cohesion and adhesion are closely related. They're both formed because of hydrogen bonding. Hydrogen bonding allows for water molecules to come together, as you can see in this image. This is a water molecule, and they're going to bind together, and that's considered cohesion because water will be able to bind to each other, and that bond, even though quite weak, will be able to keep water together as a solid form. So like if you drink a cup of glass, water is not just separated into molecules. They will bind together and form what seems to be one cohesive object. Adhesion is about the same thing, but it is how water will bind to many surfaces. So if you put water in a glass, it will bind to the edge of the glass. And both cohesion and adhesion plays a role in helping transport water against gravity in plants. Now I have an image of how that works. So this is water, am inside of this plant's stem, and you can see that cohesion is happening between these water molecules, between the hydrogen of that water molecule and the oxygen of another water molecule. And adhesion is also happening because it's sticking to the sides of that stem. So what this will do is when water is being transported from the roots of a really tall plant, such as a tree, from the roots of a tree all the way to the top of the leaves, how that works is because they can go against gravity by sticking to each other and sticking to the walls of the stem. Surface tension is a measure of how difficult it is to break the surface of a liquid. So because of water's hydrogen bonding, again, it makes it to where water has a really high surface tension because the surface of the water has so much hydrogen bonding that it acts like a film and makes it hard to break. And certain insects, such as the one I have here, that makes it where their legs are able to float on top of the water and they're able to walk. So water also can moderate temperature quite well because it has a high specific heat. Specific heat is the measure of how much energy is required to heat or raise the temperature of a liquid. And water has quite a high amount of it, so that means it can absorb a lot of energy, a lot of heat. And this means this is also because of hydrogen bonding, because hydrogen bonds absorb a lot of heat in order to break. As some of you may know, in order for the temperature of a liquid to rise, the atoms or the molecules in that liquid need to move really, really fast. So when a water gets a lot of energy, bonds are broken instead of the molecules moving fast, which means that water is able to absorb a lot of energy until the water molecules actually start moving fast in order to raise the temperature. If you try to boil a pot of water, you know that it takes a really long time because of water's high specific heat. And this helps moderate ocean temperatures because imagine if it was a hot summer day and the ocean just started boiling, right? That doesn't happen because of water's high specific heat. It can absorb a lot of energy from the sun. And what happens is in the summer, in the daylight, it'll absorb a lot of energy from the sun, and at night, it'll cool off and it'll help cool its neighboring land as well. Water also has a high heat of vaporization, which is the amount of heat a liquid needs to absorb in order to vaporize. And this makes it to where water can perform what is called evaporative cooling, which means that, such as when water goes on our skin, if there's enough heat, it'll vaporize. And when it does, it takes a lot of heat with it because of its high vaporization. So that means it'll take a lot of heat with it and it'll leave the surface very cool because of all that heat that was taken away. Water is also denser in its solid ice form, which is very rare for liquids, which means that ice is able to float on water. And if this property wasn't there, our oceans would freeze up because ice would sink, then it would freeze on the top again, and then it would sink, freeze on the top, and then sink. So our oceans would actually all freeze up, which would be very bad for the land on top of the ice and the land underneath the ice. So it's very crucial that water does not just freeze solid. Instead, ice will float, which means that polar bear seals are famous for staying on top of the ice, and little shrimps and fish are able to live underneath the ice. So when ice is formed, water molecules will turn into a crystalline structure, which means that it spreads out and it becomes less dense, which allows it to float. So water also acts as a solvent of life, and a solvent is considered the dissolving agent. So if you ever mixed salt in water, the water would be considered the solvent, while the salt would be considered the solute because it's being dissolved. So any solution with water as a solvent is going to be called an aqueous solution. So this property is also because of the polarity of water. Hydrogen regions, which are positive, as in these little white balls, you can see that they are positive, they're going to attract anions, which are negative ions, while the negative oxygens will attract positive ions, which are considered cations, as you can see in this diagram right here, and they will form what is called a hydrogen shell, which is this sphere around the dissolved ions. So the last thing I'm going to talk about today is hydrophilic substances and hydrophobic substances. This is going to be more important later on when we talk about macromolecules and cell membranes, but I'm going to be talking about them today as well. So hydrophilic substance is any substance that has an affinity for water. It likes the water, it wants to get near it. While hydrophobic substances are any substances that repels water. It does not want to bond with water, it's not going to bond with water. Hydrophobic substances are usually going to be substances that are non-polar. Right? Non-polar is not going to bond with a polar because a non-polar molecule is not going to be able to form bonds with any other polar molecule. So a classic example of this is going to be a phospholipid, which makes up the cell membrane. Phospholipid and the cell membrane are very important properties in biology. We're going to be talking about them later on. So I'm just going to mention this because a phospholipid has a head, which peeps out right here on top of the cell and at the bottom of the cell. It is considered hydrophilic, which means that it is able to be next to water. While a hydrophobic example would be its tails, which are portrayed here in the middle of the cell membrane. It's not going to want to touch water. That's all I'm going to be talking about for this video. But my next video, I'm going to be talking about the major macromolecules. So carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids.